As an alternative to retopology in Marvelous Designer, you can of course use Blender to create your low-poly mesh. Depending on how you went about to create your clothes items, this can be a matter of just a few seconds. For example, if you use the multi-resolution modifier for sculpting details. Or we need to manually create a new topology if you used Dintopo or other destructive modeling and sculpting techniques to arrive at your high-poly mesh. The first case is kind of self-explanatory. Suppose you have followed the approach of duplicating parts of the body and then adding modifiers like the shrink wrap, multi-res or solidify modifiers. With this approach, your original topology remains intact, which means we can simply duplicate the mesh. Let's name the original low poly and the duplicate high poly. Before just deleting all modifiers on the low poly version, we need to be a bit careful. The two meshes, the low poly and high poly one, need to overlap to a very high degree if we want to have clean bakes later. So if I just disable the multi-res modifier here, the difference between the low and high poly vest is too great and this will not work at all. Let's reduce the multi-res subdivisions step by step. It looks like one subdivision does the job to keep the general shape of the vest while still getting rid of all the details. Now let's apply the multi-res. Same thing for the pants. Let's duplicate the mesh and rename it, and then drop the subdivision on the low poly model to 1 and apply the modifier. And there you have it, a low poly and a high poly version of the outfit. Now what about the second case, where you actually have a high resolution mesh to begin with? Here we need to go through the standard retopology workflow that would apply to any sculpted object. Shift right click on the mesh where you would like to begin creating polygons to position the cursor there. Create a plane and delete 3 vertices. Now select the one remaining vertex, press Shift S and select Selection to Cursor. And then activate Snapping to Face. Now you can begin creating your geometry. Extrude the vertices, join those two by pressing F, then create a face by selecting all 4 and pressing F again. Also, if you go into X-ray mode, it is easier to see your new mesh. You can also add a mirror modifier if you have a symmetrical cloth item. Select the vest as the mirror object and activate clipping. Now continue extruding along the neck to create a first edge loop and move the vertices to match the high poly geometry if necessary. You can also create different unconnected patches and then join them together. Sometimes this is easier than working your way down. You can also use primitives in combination with the shrink wrap modifier to create larger patches, similar to what we did with the belts in chapter 5.3. If you have cloth pieces where you know you will want to use different materials later, make sure your topology follows the shape of the high poly mesh. If some vertices end up inside the clothes instead of staying on the surface, just drop and apply a shrink wrap modifier to reposition all vertices on the surface of the mesh. When you are done with the main retopology pass, add a subdivision and a shrink wrap modifier again to increase the resolution of your low poly model. You can apply the mirror modifier at this point, then make sure all border vertices align nicely with the original. For the pants, I use cylinders again to create the legs and waist part of the pants, and then join them together. Well, that's it. We are done with retopology using only Blender's native functions. There are also a couple of add-ons that make this process a lot easier, for example Retopo Flow, Speed Retopo or others. You're welcome to check them out and incorporate them in your workflow. Also, I admit that these clothes are rather simple in terms of design, so the retopology process is easy. It can become more challenging if you have a complex clothes pattern with lots of small pieces. but the general principles of retopology would apply in any case. I would suggest to practice with simpler shapes first, and then increase the complexity as you get more routine in the workflow. And one final remark on the poly count of the low poly clothes. If it were a standalone model, we would be free to choose any resolution we want. But in this case, we are creating a layer basically on top of the metahuman body, which is expected to conform to the deformations of the body. If we drop our resolution too low, the clothes would obviously have too little geometry to bend in the right way. So for better results of our rigged and skinned clothes, the resolution should roughly match the resolution of the body mesh. This brings us to the end of the retopology step of the pipeline. Next we will look into UV unwrapping and how to set up your meshes and materials for texturing.